What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown, a crime history podcast. I am your host, Jeff Nadu. If you're watching this video on YouTube, make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you're checking out the channel for the first time, or you just haven't done it yet, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit-down video. If you're checking us out on our audio platforms on Google Pods, Spotify, or iTunes, welcome in. Make sure you leave us a detailed review of what you think of the show today. We are back, ladies and gentlemen, with another terrific episode here on our weekly show. This is already episode 102, and we, as always, get another great episode planned for you today. I want to, again, go back to last week and really just thank Howard Santos for coming on the show, the Gambino associate. Really well received, really enjoyable episode. And a lot of people, I think, felt like it was nice to finally hear from someone different. You know, we've heard from Gravano and A-Light and Borello and Catolo and all these different guys, but it's rare that you find some new blood, right, if you will. And, you know, over the last couple of weeks, we've been able to find that with Dom Sakali and obviously Howie Santos. So it was nice to do that and get some new blood here in the mob genre. But sit back, relax. We got another great show planned, as I said. And, you know, this week I'm getting into someone that I've wanted to do for a while. And I remember when I was, as many of you know, I'm in the gambling business. I got involved with gambling content many years ago in 2009, 2010. And I haven't ever really talked about how I got into content, but it actually happened because of gambling. And I had been gambling since I was younger. And I remember at one point, I wanted to kind of create a platform for myself to share my opinions about gambling. And I remember this little thing called Twitter started in the late 2000s. And I made an account and I was able to kind of grow my ability through my love for sports betting. And I really got to know gambling and understand gambling. And I remember around that time here in the Philadelphia area, there was a big gambling case going on involving a guy called Vito Mastronardo. And over the years, I've researched Vito. And I think what I find interesting most about him is when we hear the words gambling, bookmaking, we always think of the Mafia, right? That's something that they've always had their teeth involved in, whether it was the bookmaking itself, setting lines, collecting, loan sharking, whatever. Bookmaking is, according to many, kind of the straw that stirs the Mafia, you know, because that leads to loan sharking, that leads to other things. And, you know, in the case of Vito Mastronardo, he's a Philly legend, really. He's a guy who was connected through marriage to one of the most powerful people in the Philadelphia area at the time. He's a guy who became an industry standard. Bookmakers around the country knew who Vito Mastronardo was. And in his 30 plus years of being one of the most prominent bookmakers in America, he did two things. He never worked for anyone, and he never kicked up a cent to the American Mafia. It's not to say they didn't try, but we're going to get to all that and more in another great episode of the Sit Down. However, before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about Harry's. Now, as the spring and summer months start to pop up, one of the most important things for men and for women is grooming. You want to make sure you look good when you go out to the club or you go out for dinner or you go to a party. You want to make sure you look well presented. And Harry's has you covered. Essentially, what they do is deal with grooming, most notably razors. And the question with razors always is, why do they cost so much? You never seem to have one when you need one. Harry's razors are not only cost effective, but they're incredibly sharp and made in their own factory in Germany. Most importantly, as I said, cost. They cost as little as $2 per blade. Do what I did. Go get involved with Harry's. Go get a quality shave without the hassle with a $3 Harry's trial set. Now, what you're going to get is a $15 value for just $3. And what it's going to include is a 5-blade German engineered razor, weighted handle, foaming shave gel, and a travel cover. You're going to get the best and ergonomic shaving blades, again, that hold up the test of time. And you can also get a lot more with your subscription if you go ahead and get Harry's. You can get shaving creams, post-shave balm, body washes, hydrating lotions, everything that looks great in your new bathroom or wherever you do your grooming habits. which I would hope is in the bathroom. That said, do what I did. And just by being a listener or viewer of the sit down, you are going to get a $15 value Truman Shave trial set right now for just $3 by going to harrys.com/sit. Again, that's harrys.com/sit. Make sure your shave, make sure your grooming stuff goes smoothly, if you will, and go get a Harry's Truman Shave trial set, a $15 value right now. Get it for just $3 by going to harrys.com/sit. Let's get into the episode today. Really, again, one that I've wanted to do for a while. The story of Joe Vito Mastronardo. Next on the sit down. Joe Vito was born in 1950 in Philadelphia. Now, the interesting thing that I would learn about Joe Vito Mastronardo is that his father, Joe Mastronardo Sr., was actually very involved with the gambling trade as well. It was uncovered that early in Joe Vito's life, his father was actually a bookmaker himself in the Philadelphia area. Now, I do want to commend the great NewYorkMafia.com. I found some really good info on the early life of Joe Vito through that place, and they do a great job over there, so go check them out. I would learn that Joe Vito's father was a bookmaker, and he taught his son the ins and outs of gambling as well. And from what I've found as well is that Joe Vito early in his life was particularly good at numbers, mathematics, odds, putting together odds quickly, and would actually early in his life get a job at some of the local country clubs in the area. Now, Joe Vito Mastronardo had one brother called John Mastronardo, and he was also down the road very involved with what they did as a unit. As I said, as a teen, Joe Vito understood gambling because of his father. He began working at local golf courses as a caddy. Now, if you know anything about sports bettors, generally golf goes hand in hand. Men love to golf. Men also love to gamble. And what's another thing you find at country clubs on the main line of Philadelphia? Rich people, people that have plenty of excess income that they like to plot down on sporting events. And what Joe Vito starts to realize is they use him as the caddy as a way to go put some bets in. And Joe Vito, the smart kid that he is, his father's in that business. He realizes, hey, you know what? I'm making some money myself. I'll back some of these bets. And by my mid to late teens, I'm already becoming a bookmaker myself. Joe Vito was a really smart dude, and he never really held who he was, right? Really from the beginning. He would be a natural at what he did, and he really understood, what was a good and bad bet. He understood how to lay things off. He understood how to always not involve yourself with violence, because that's what makes bookmaking illegal, right? It's can't be taxed, and people don't pay taxes on it. And B, they resort to violence when someone doesn't pay. They hit you in the leg with a rod. They beat you up. They put you in the hospital. That makes it illegal. And that's what the Mafia was doing. They have bookmaking customers. They're taking bets. And if somebody goes 5K and they don't have it, they either make them get a loan. And then if they don't pay the loan, they get beat up, or they get jumped, or whatever. Joe Vito, even in his early years, catered to being a gentleman and ran his operation like a business. Now, eventually for Joe Vito, by the late 60s and early 70s, he continues to almost rise in the bookmaking trade. And again, he's taken on a different approach to gambling. And as a bookmaker, it's not resorting to violence. It's not to hiding all your income and not paying anything. He realized that he could do this as his life's work because he filled the need for someone that wanted something. Again, everybody gambles. He found a need, he filled the need, and he provided a quality experience. Now, eventually, Joe Vito, moving and shaking in the country clubs and the right neighborhoods, he eventually meets a local woman called Joanna Rizzo. Now, if you notice the last name Rizzo, she was the only daughter of Philadelphia Police Commissioner Frank Rizzo. Now, anybody that is from the Philadelphia area knows the name Frank Rizzo. Maybe they've seen a video about him. They know that he's controversial. Frank Rizzo essentially was the police commissioner in Philadelphia beginning in 1967. He's made commissioner. By 1971, he decides that he wants to run for mayor of Philadelphia. And in 1972, he becomes the 93rd mayor of the city of brotherly love. He would serve 2 terms until 1980. Now, if you know anything about Frank Rizzo, you will know that he is controversial. He's a guy that, throughout the years had kind of established power really towards the end of the civil rights movement. And he had a lot of back and forth with the black community. There were certain things he did that were very below bar as being the mayor and also the police commissioner. Now, this, I believe, was an integral part of Joe Vito's life and career, because the one thing that anybody knew that did business with Joe Vito was who his father-in-law was. Father-in-law was the most powerful person essentially in the city of Philadelphia, both in the law enforcement part, but also he was the mayor. He had connections everywhere. And I think this played a huge part in what allowed Joe Vito to run basically as his own entity. Because anyone that knows the mob in the 70s and 80s, if you did business in and around Philadelphia, you were kicking up to the mob. Whether you were the Black Mafia, whether you were the Greek Mafia, whether you were the K&A gang, you were involved with the Mafia. Now, Joe Vito wasn't necessarily in the city limits, but you better believe the mob was going to come to him. And I'm going to tell a story in a little bit about something his son would actually say that his father told him at one point. Joe Vito ultimately would take a liking to Joanna Rizzo. And one thing we would find out about Frank Rizzo is he didn't exactly like his son-in-law's job or business, but he began to accept it as an acceptable form of a way to make money. He treated his daughter right, and that's ultimately what he wanted in the end. Now, around this time as well, Joe Vito's brother John was actually a standout football player at Villanova University. He was a wide receiver, and at one point would even try out for the Philadelphia Eagles. He would never ultimately get there, but post-football career, he would head into business with his brother as a bookmaker. In 1978, Joe Vito Mastronardo would marry Joanna Rizzo in a very nice ceremony in the Philadelphia area. Things were good for Joe Vito. He had a wife now. He was making a lot of money in the bookmaking trade, and he was beginning to rise as one of the biggest and preeminent bookmakers in America. Now, his first arrest would actually come in the mid to late 70s, and most of those arrests were either thrown out or he was acquitted. Now, we have to wonder, did his father-in-law play a part in keeping him out of prison? He had everything working for him. This is the kind of bookie you want to be, right? If you were in the 70s or 80s, you want to be a guy who has a quality list of customers that pay. You don't going to get involved with nonsense, and you handle your business the right way. And I'll get into how Joe Vito did things. I'll get into the Joe Vito line. This guy was doing it all the right way. Plus, he had connections to a very powerful person in the Philadelphia area. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Joe Vito Mastronardo's business and how it was run. His whole mantra in his business was very simple. I want to provide a high-level betting experience for high-end clientele. And we have to remember, he's working out of, as a kid, country clubs. And in country clubs that are very prestigious, you have what? Lawyers, doctors, business owners, stockbrokers, very rich individuals, people that are living in some of the highest end areas of the Philadelphia suburbs, the Main Line, Montgomery County. And what do these guys like to do? We saw it in the film Rounders. They like to sports bet, and they like to play cards, and they like to bet on golf and everything they're doing, right? This was such a smart way to do things because he knew that the people that were betting with him, he's not dealing with the everyday bettor, the $50, $100 wager guy. He's dealing with people that are wagering at the least $1,000, all the way up to hundreds of thousands of dollars a game. And Joe Vito had one rule. You cannot pay me, but you know what you're not going to get to do going forward? Bet with me. That's what he said. Joe Vito had a strict rule. I'm not going to hurt anyone. You just aren't going to play with me anymore. And you look at the amount of money, 10, 20, 50, $100,000 a game is being wagers. Joe Vito did it the right way. He claimed his income, right? He filed tax returns. He didn't involve himself in nefarious activities. He did things the right way. And like I said, down the road, the way he did business became an industry standard. He was so respected in gambling communities, something would be created called the Joe Vito line, which bookmakers would use as a way of reference to make sure they had the right line. So he becomes this namesake in the gambling community. People in Las Vegas knew who he was. People on the West Coast knew who he was. And he had clients everywhere. He's beginning to create not just a network locally and regionally, but nationally and internationally. And by the mid 80s, he's a very rich individual. We're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars a week in bets. We're talking about millions of dollars a week is coming through Joe Vito's betting network. This guy is making big money. Now, I do want to tell a story. By this point, Joe Vito and his wife, Joanna, as she kisses her father, Frank Rizzo, they would have one son, a person called Joe Mastronardo, Joe F. Mastronardo. Here he is in his Trump regalia. I guess he's a Trump fan in his later years. He would actually play an integral part in his father's operation as well. Now, down the road, about 10 years ago, Joe Vito's son, Joe, would tell a story that according to him, according to his father, he was once in the mid 80s approached by people of Nicky Scarfo, essentially saying that they wanted Joe Vito to kick up to their operation. According to Joe Jr., the son of Vito Mastronardo, he would say that his father essentially told Nicky Scarfo to, quote, fuck himself, and that he wasn't giving him anything. And we have to wonder, did the connections he had in the early 80s, the fact that his father-in-law was Frank Rizzo, did that play a part? Joe Vito didn't mess with the mob. He just said, I don't want to do business with you. It's pretty simple. And nothing ever happened to him. Now, again, we can look at that story and we would ask the kid, Joe Jr., why would he, what would he lie and what would he have to gain by that? Joe Vito Mastronardo was very open about who he was. He didn't make any bones about it. According to him, life's work was to be a bookmaker. That's his thing. He did it the right way. He didn't feel like he was doing anything illegal. He did everything up to board, as I said. Now, in 1986, Joe Vito would start to get on the purview of law enforcement, particularly at the local level. They would claim by the mid to late 80s, Joe Vito and his brother were involved in essentially a $50 million gambling ring, and they would indict them, stating that they were laundering money as well, according to the indictment, through a brokerage firm. Now, ultimately, we would find out that the laundering of money was never actually able to be proven, and that Joe Vito and his brother essentially got off with a slap on the wrist. We have to realize that a lot of the involvement that they have and most of the things that they're doing are not necessarily illegal, right? They're paying taxes. They haven't hurt anyone. There's no assaults here. They're trying to get them, though. They're trying to hem them up on higher end charges because they're doing stuff that in the eyes of the law, they're not looked at as, they look like they're getting over on the system. Joe Vito Mastronardo ultimately in that 1986 case would get 2 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. Keep in mind, he is making millions of dollars a year, so it's a small price to pay. It's almost like every couple of years he has to do a year or two to keep the government off his back. They were looking for anything they could do to hem up him and his brother and his family. By the late 80s, early 90s, Joe Vito would get out of prison. He would have to serve 5 years probation. So he's kind of hemmed up on what he could absolutely do because they're going to monitor everything he has going on. Now, into the late 90s, early 2000s, the important thing that Joe Vito starts to do is he begins getting very much involved in upping and creating heavier technology, right? Realizing that phone numbers might not be the way to go anymore. And the problem that you have with this sort of trade is you have to keep everything on notepads, right? Computers make it a little easier. You have cell phones. And he starts establishing a huge network of people, agents, collectors, people that were helpful in the community. They were at restaurants, they were at golf courses, they were settling up with bettors, they were paying bettors, they were taking profits from bettors. This is a huge undertaking, and the government and the law enforcement is looking for any way to hem Joe Vito up on what he's doing. Is he keeping meticulous records? You almost look at the way Joe Vito is doing things is almost like the way you would look at like an escort business. It toes the lines of legality, but as long as you stay up to health standards in certain states, you pay your taxes, you do the right things, you can operate freely. And that's what Joe Vito believed that he was doing. Now, as I said, he had people working for him throughout not only America, but he even had international clients. They were all betting with him, and we're not talking again about a couple dollars. By the mid 2000s, the Mastronardo betting operation had over 1,100 players, and every player is high end. They're betting thousands of dollars a game. College basketball, college football, the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, whatever they can get their hands on. And by this point, what we're starting to realize in the gambling world is it's becoming higher end technology wise. So what ultimately would happen is they would get away from the 1-800 numbers, the 1-900 numbers. And what people like Joe Vito were doing is they were going to countries like Antigua, Costa Rica. Now, Costa Rica is a mainstay for international betting, right? In Costa Rica, they have places called wire rooms. Okay. Now, in a wire room, you have people that run computers, they set the lines, and there are these websites called pay-per-head websites. And Joe Vito would purchase these pay-per-head websites, which would give a user a username and password. It would allow the user, let's say they're in Kansas, to log into the website with their username and password and bet on whatever they want. At the end of the week, Joe Vito would, through his agents, go to every bettor and say, okay, bettor A is up 600. Bettor B is up 7,000. Bettor C is down 9,000. And you settle up. And he had agents that were running in certain areas. Each website he gets, maybe every year, he rehashes and gets a new website and stays ahead of everything and makes it easy. He doesn't have to sit at a phone. He doesn't have to sit and pay people to answer telephone. This is a much more seamless way, at least to Joe Vito, to run a gambling operation. Now, according to court documents, through the money Joe Vito's making, and it's in the millions, he would have money stashed in many international banks, including in Malta, Sweden, Antigua, and Portugal. And then again, as I said, he had his wire room based in Costa Rica. Now, one client, this is one client. There's court documents stating that one client in 1 week owed him $250,000 betting on college basketball. That's the kind of money this guy's making, big time cash. In 2006, though, things start to begin coming undone for Joe Vito. In that year, him, his brother, and his son are all arrested by local jurisdictions, and they try to get him on essentially a popcorn headline case. Now, through warrants and things like that, they would actually seize about $2.5 million in cash through banks, safe deposit boxes, and even 500 grand in a Cadillac belonging to Joe Vito that was in Florida. Now, by this point, Joe Vito's father had moved to Florida, and him and his brother and his sons would go down and see him from time to time. Feds would confiscate 500 grand from a car that Joe Vito had. So he had plenty of cash. It's not illegal to have 500,000 in cash, especially if you're rich. But Joe Vito, again, had to deal with the law. What they ultimately did was this was something that the government was using as a way as almost a popcorn headline case, but to roll it up to something bigger down the road. They wanted this to lead to a bigger investigation down the road. They would get Joe Vito to plead guilty, and he got probation. But as I said, this would open the book, not only on him, but on his son, Joe Jr., as well as his brother. Now, they would stop doing business for a period of time, but in 2008, this is when the FBI and the Feds start getting involved with this case. According to the indictment in 2008, they believe this is when Joe Vito started using and doing his operation again. According to the investigation in the Montgomery County, Pennsylvania Detectives Bureau, beginning in October 2008, a detective called James Vinter would make contact with someone he would call Confidential Source 1, CS1. Now, CS1 would tell Detective Vinter that he had been placing bets over the phone with an individual called Edward Fagan. We would learn that Edward Fagan was essentially a chief confidant of Mastronardo and a collector, and that Fagan had resumed bookmaking activity in Montgomery County. So essentially, Joe Vito starts to give people that are working with him the go-ahead to begin doing things again. Now, Confidential Source 1 would claim that Fagan paid and collected gambling debts on a weekly basis at a restaurant in Hatfield, Pennsylvania called the Century House. Now, according to the Century House's website, they are now permanently closed, but this is what this guy would do. This Fagan guy, on behalf of Mastronardo as a collector, would go into this restaurant, have dinner, have some drinks. People come up to him, they'd have a drink too, they'd collect cash, and that was his headquarters, if you will. That was where he did his business. Now, in the indictment also, the Montgomery County Detectives Bureau would also discuss that in May of 2009, CS1 would also report that Fagan would continue to take bets from individuals in Montgomery County, and that Fagan had bragged regularly about a group of bettors from the Lehigh Valley Country Club that just on the weekend, wager-wise, would escalate above 50,000 up to 100,000. Now, on one occasion, this source would tell the Montgomery Detectives Bureau that he would deliver money directly through Fagan to Joe Vito Mastronardo Jr. at a country club in the Philadelphia area called Cedarbrook. Now, Detective Vinter would meet CS1 a third time in August of 2009. He would also tell the detective CS1 that Fagan was using a website to take wagers called exclusivewager.com. Remember what I discussed about bettors on a website with a username and password. This confidential informant gives up his username and password to strengthen the fact that this is the site they're using to do all the business. So this is a big piece of information that they're getting. They now have the wager website, because what these guys do, people like Joe Vito, is they're smart enough to every year or so create another website. So it's hard to track them, right? So maybe you have exclusivewager.com and you have bet50.com, and they just create new ones, right? And they just transfer all the information, and records are kept for all this stuff. So they're starting to create a method of madness to what Joe Vito is doing. Now, in the May and 2009 conversations with CS1, they would be dated as August 17, 2009, and all that was put into evidence. Now, police were also able to corroborate several pieces of information obtained from this same CI. They would again use the information they gained in the 2006 case to start building a bigger case. So again, the 2006 case was weak, but it was a way to put this on the Fed's radar and everyone involved in this. Now, ultimately, between 2006 and 2010, what we would find out that Joe Vito actually made about $4 million, according to him, in income. Now, he would pay $1.1 million in taxes. So I guess we have to ask ourselves, what is he doing illegal here? He's not hurting anybody. He's paying his taxes. He's a citizen. He owns a home. He has a life. And by this point, he had a very nice home. This is his estate in and around Abington, Pennsylvania. Had a beautiful home, had cars, had vacation homes, lived lavishly, him and his wife. The problem for Joe Vito is ultimately they're building and using wiretaps to obtain information about him. Things are starting to become undone. And they wanted Joe Vito Mastronardo. They wanted him off the street. They felt that he had operated under the rule of law for a long time, And he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. And again, as I said, he made it very clear of who he was. He never pulled any punches about who he was. He was a bookmaker. He'd been a bookmaker since he was a teenager, but he didn't hurt anyone. He did everything the right way, and he checked, every sentence, essentially. In June of 2010, though, Joe Vito would be arrested, and the case would be turned over to the feds. And by 2012, they would come down very hard on the Mastronardo betting organization. They would execute multiple warrants, up to 40 warrants, on not only Joe Vito, but his son Joe and his brother John. In all, 19 people would be indicted. Now, in the case, what was interesting, and I remember these news footage tapes. I remember watching this on the news. I remember the day Joe Vito was arrested in, I think it was 2013. The feds dug up his lawn, and they would locate like $1 million in cash in PVC pipes in his lawn. They would find several other 100,000 in the home that he had. And you also look at in all his accounts and international banks. He had about $3 million in international banking accounts, as well as in excess of over $6 million. What they would also find are gambling records. Everyone's involved, including in the indictment is Joanna Mastronardo, Joe Vito's wife. Now, the feds would state that she was intentionally structuring cash deposits under a certain amount so they wouldn't be hit by the CTR report at the bank. Anytime you make a deposit above $10,000, it initiates what's called a currency transaction report. And I remember when I used to work at a bank, we had to fill these out, and you had to report amounts above 10 grand. So she might deposit $9,995. So she doesn't have to fill out the CTR, and it doesn't get on the radar. So it's structuring deposits. She may do it every 2 days. And it's, again, according to them, illegal. Joe Vito would have to face the real possibility that he was going to go away for a period of time. This was a big problem for him. He would have to forfeit a lot of money. And by this point, Joe Vito Mastronardo had gotten cancer. He had multiple different cancers, and he was beginning to look weaker and weaker. Remember, though, and this is the most important thing about this, Joe Vito Mastronardo, in the 30-year history of him being a bookmaker, there is no indication that he ever hurt anyone in anything. The people that bet with him could lose it. They could win. There was nothing where he was making people addicted to gambling or anything like that. He paid his taxes. He pretty much did everything the right way. But in the end, they would hit him with multiple counts, including, and I want to go through all these because there's kind of a wide range of charges. In all, 19 defendants were charged with operating a continuing criminal enterprise, racketeering, operating an illegal gambling business, money laundering, conspiracy, interstate travel in aid of racketeering, transmitting, wagering information, banking law violations, and illegally structuring the deposits. Again, the people arrested: Joe Vito Mastronardo, his brother John, his son Joe, his wife Joanna, Edward Fagan, multiple runners and collectors. Like I said, in all, 19 people were jammed up in this case. Joe Vito was weak by this point. He knew, though, he could take care of his family. And what the feds did is a real slimy thing. They threw his wife into things as a way to say, you know what, man, we got you here, and we're going to go after your wife. So why don't you just plead on something? We'll give you jail time, and you can put this behind you. But remember, by this point, he's in his 60s. He's an old man, and he's sick. He's got cancer. And we know that in the federal prison system, they cannot help people with cancer. They just don't. They don't care about you. You're a federal prisoner. They don't care what they do to you. Joe Vito Mastronardo would ultimately get 8 to 59 months in the federal prison system. And he would also have to face the fact that he had a 2010 case that he had to deal with as well. Now, the government would give him an additional 20 months on this case, an incredibly draconian sentence for something. Even the judge in the case at one point would call what Joe Vito was in as, quote, terrible health, including to an article written by George Anastasia. This is extremely extensive, isn't it? It's such a rough punishment for someone who, for the most part, did what he's had to do. Joe Vito's brother, John, would ultimately get 9 months in federal prison, and his son, Joe, would get 5 months. But as the head of the organization, Joe Vito was hit the hardest, and they hit him hard. His son would say and talk very openly about his father, about his involvement, about what they did to his father. And I got to admit, I mean, when you look back on everything, it's honestly pretty sad, if we're being honest. Um, in an interview with George Anastasia, Joe Jr. or Joe F. Mastronardo would say that his father was, quote, the greatest and smartest, toughest guy in the whole world. If I turn out to be half the man my father was, that would mean I'm an exceptional human being. Now, he would also go on to say that, quote, they even acknowledged that given my father's failing health and frail condition, he wouldn't be back to gambling. Now, the prosecutors indirectly said as much in their sentencing memo, given that the defendant's current health is extremely unlikely he will resume bookmaking activities. So we have to ask ourselves, why such a hefty and heavy sentence? Again, it's not like this guy's a mobster. It's not like this guy's out hurting people and beating people up and really hurting the quality of life in his neighborhood. This guy was a giving guy. He made money. He did well. He never did anything illegal. Now, you also look at another comment that Joe Vito had, and he went pretty hard at the government. He said, quote, there's absolutely no reason he should have been in a jail cell. The whole case was a vendetta. In no way, shape, or form should he have gone to jail. It's absolutely disgusting. They are despicable people. They killed my father for nothing, for having gambled. My dad was a man of integrity, and those people have no integrity. They knew there was a great chance of this happening, and they didn't care. Couldn't said it better myself. Joe Vito would die several weeks later on November 9th, 2015, at the Federal Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Devens, Massachusetts. He was 65 years old. On this channel, I cover some of the most depraved people in the history of this country: gangsters, mobsters, drug dealers, racketeers, loan sharks, murderers, extortion artists, bad people. But in my 102 episodes of doing this show, this is the first episode that I've done on just a bookmaker, an interesting guy who had an interesting gambling from a young age, did everything the right way, made it a point to follow rules, to not pay taxes, to not hurt anybody. And I have to admit, the one dude that I always have felt sorry for was Joe Vito. He had a business that worked. He had something that did things the right way. He never went with the mob or did anything like that. He defied the mob. He was the son-in-law of a Philly mayor. And I agree wholeheartedly with his son on what he said. Joe Vito was a professional. He was a guy that did things correctly. And I think what ultimately would happen to him is disgraceful, at least to me. That said, he had an industry standard that people respected, and he's still talked about today in certain gambling communities in Las Vegas and places like that. I will say that anytime you gamble, it's important that you do it responsibly. Make sure that you're doing it the right way. Anytime you gamble, that's important to do. And I just wanted to leave that as we head out of the episode today. Joe Vito, the man who at one point told Nicky Scarfo allegedly to go F himself. I have to say he's probably the only person to ever say that. Pretty interesting story nonetheless. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm trying to keep these around 40 minutes to an hour, which we've been able to do. Sometimes when we have an interview, it goes a little bit longer. But next week, we'll be back with another great episode of the Sit Down. We'll get into another really interesting crime story. I would again say, out of all the episodes I've ever done, this is probably the one person that, at least to me, didn't actually commit any crimes. But according to the federal government, he was a delirious bookmaker. That said, before you go, please go check out Harry's. Go get yourself a shave trial set right now for just $3 by using our link, harrys.com/sit, S-I-T. I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. As always, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe so you never miss a show. Make sure you leave us a detailed review. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.